Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
President Trump meets the landman. Welcome to the Friday edition as big oil executives head to the White House to talk about the president's request that they invest tens of billions of dollars into Venezuela's oil industry. We're going to bring you a live report from the White House in just a moment and spend some time this hour with the president's former legislative liaison. Republican strategist Marc will be with us on the potential for oil subsidies coming from Capitol Hill just a day after Republican lawmakers bucked the president on health care and war powers. Later as well, our conversation with former White House economist Heather Boushey on this jobs day. And it's all after a look at Wall Street. Charlie Pellet has his read on the market right now. The Friday trade. Charlie, how's it going?
Right now, higher across the board, very close to session highs on the S&P. We got a lot going on. Jobs Friday, Energy Friday, but not Supreme Court Friday. No ruling on tariffs today. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. Right to the numbers here. S&P up 43, on track for a winning week. Last time I checked, looking at a gain of just about 1.6% on the week. 69.64 where we stand now, up by about 0.6%.
White House
the Dow higher now by
right?
205. That is a gain of just about 0.4%. We've got NASDAQ up 180 now. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 0.8%. The Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares ripping higher, outperforming, up now by 1%. Your 10-year 4.17% with a 2-year 3.53%. Gold is up $8 the ounce. Spot gold, $44.87, up by about 0.2%. Silver back to very close to $80 the ounce, up 3.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude moving higher on Iran tensions, among other factors. I'll be talking about that at the Energy Conference. WTI right now up 2.7%, $59.31 for a barrel of crude. Bitcoin up 0.1%, 91,320 now on Bitcoin. Shares of mortgage stocks are surging after President Trump said on his social media platform that he was directing the purchase of $200 billion in mortgage bonds. Now, we are looking at double-digit gains for a lot of these mortgage names. Case in point, Open Door Technologies up 17.5%. Rocket companies up by just about 7%, but shares of Loan Depot Inc. up 24.6%. Recapping, stocks move higher, S&P up by 0.6%. And for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Mathieu.
Okay, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Charlie will have more on the markets coming up in about 20 minutes' time here as part of our program. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington with eyes on big oil stocks, with a who's who of the oil industry at the White House today. The top 17 or so companies are going to be in the cabinet room, of course, as Charlie has been mentioning, talking with President Trump about the job ahead in Venezuela. Shares of ExxonMobil up about 1%. Same for Chevron. Valero is down almost 4%. With the idea of refining much more heavy, sour crude from Venezuela. The question is, what will be the question? President Trump has some big asks of these executives who may or may not feel like there's a big return on investment in this case, particularly knowing that this project will likely last years and could outlast this administration. There are also questions about what the oil companies might be pursuing today, with CNN reporting that they've been crafting a plan to present the president before he ever gets to his own agenda here, coming with conditions that the U.S. lift more sanctions and provide more supplies necessary to move the oil. Either way, as Donald Trump says, we're taking it. And he made that case again on the Hannity program last evening on Fox News. Listen.
We're taking billions and billions of dollars worth of oil, and it'll be hundreds of billions of dollars. It'll be trillions of dollars. We'll be running the oil. We're going to meet with the biggest oil people in the world. They're all coming here. The top 14 companies are coming here. They're going to go in. They're going to rebuild the whole oil infrastructure. They're going to spend at least $100 billion.
At least $100 billion. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is on the north lawn of the White House waiting for their arrival right now. They're about an hour and a half away based on the White House schedule, and she joins us now for an update. How's this all going to work here, Tyler? And will these executives be seen by the media?
Well, as of now, that meeting is closed to the press, so we'll end up seeing if it gets to be opened up. Though we had reporting, as we spoke about last hour, that one of the potential conditions on the table was to keep this closed door, because we know that this administration is really pressuring these oil companies. They're looking for buy-in from big oil to advance U.S. interests in Venezuela. And at this point, it's not clear if they're on board, because our own reporting indicates, people familiar with the matter telling us, that these executives have in some cases made the case directly to the administration that they are weary about the amount of investment without physical security or financial guarantees being on the table. And as you and I have covered all week on Balance of Power, President Trump had previously suggested that the U.S. could subsidize or reimburse these oil companies. But this morning, the Interior Secretary Doug Burgum told Bloomberg Television that all of the capital is going to come completely from the oil companies, suggesting that there would not be U.S. financial support. Of course, the other big question for these companies has to do with political stability in the wake of the U.S. capturing Nicolas Maduro. But to that end, this White House asserts that the interim Venezuelan government is cooperating with the U.S., with President Trump suggesting that they are already cooperating in terms of giving access to Venezuela's oil infrastructure. So it is going to be something that we watch really closely how this meeting ends up shaking out, because it is very clear that these oil companies need to see some firmer guarantees from this White House.
Really interesting here, Tyler. Do we know anything about what's going to be the venue for this meeting beyond the cabinet room? When you have the biggest executives from the oil industry come over, you don't serve Subway sandwiches, right?
I don't think that is likely to be on the menu. But of course, Joe, this is a very high stakes meeting. You're talking about the heads of the biggest oil companies, Exxon, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, Continental Resources, and then those counterparts in the administration that have really been leading this charge, including the U.S. Energy Secretary Christopher Wright, who's going to be joining us later tonight on Balance of Power, and then the Interior Secretary Doug Burgum. But most importantly, of course, it's going to be President Trump in that room, as he has made it absolutely clear that he wants to see this support from oil companies to advance U.S. interests. Right, Joe? We often hear the president talk about this need to get Venezuela on more solid economic footing before we can talk about the U.S. setting a potential date for a democratic transition.
Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall with us from the White House. Tyler, let us know when they show up. We'll be curious to see if they come on down the driveway or maybe the back door. There's no appetite at the moment, at least it seems, for subsidizing this whole project, as Tyler just mentioned. And it's something that we asked Byron Donalds about. The Republican congressman from Florida clearly has no appetite. Listen.
I'm not really interested in subsidies per se. I think the oil markets themselves will provide all of the ability for companies, if they go back in, to rebuild that infrastructure to be able to make money. I don't think it's much more about subsidies. I think it's much more about a stable government in Venezuela, stable security apparatus. If those things are in place, there'll be plenty of opportunity, whether it's oil companies or any other company, to go and invest in Venezuela.
Kind of like what Tyler just said. Now, as we try to seize on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, there's no voice more appropriate than Marc Short, the Republican strategist, joins us right now. Former White House Director of Legislative Affairs and former Chief of Staff Vice President Mike Pence. Marc, I hope your year is going well. Welcome back.
Happy New Year. Thanks for having me back.
On Bloomberg, of course. Your thoughts on the involvement of Congress here, the appetite that they might have, seems similar to the appetite we're told some of these oil executives might have of investing in this project.
I can't imagine there'd be much interest in Congress to use taxpayer dollars to help subsidize this. But I'm not so convinced that there won't be executive opportunities for subsidization. When I hear the commentary from Burgum that's not off the table, I wouldn't necessarily say it's off the table until the president says it's off the table. And I think everything you laid out is exactly right, that these executives are going to want to know there's some sort of assurance of stability in the country before making massive investments at shareholder risk. They need to know that risk is somewhat mediated. But I think that there's, for multiple of these companies, significant amounts of dollars the World Bank has ruled is owed to them. And I think the president can have a way of ensuring they get those resources if they make commitments to invest.
Okay, interesting. How's this meeting going to go when you're in the room with Donald Trump? You've been in a lot of meetings with this president. Door closes, guys like me are thrown out of the room. Is there an agenda that's set, or are we just kind of riffing because they're people who know each other and have relationships.
I think there's probably an agenda that Secretary Wright, Secretary Burgum have of what's the path forward. I think that the president, though, prefers to have these meetings more relationship-oriented.
Right.
And so they'll be needing to keep the agenda on track. But I think he's going to take it where he kind of
makes it harder to say no that way, doesn't it?
But I also think that it would be incredibly unlikely to me that cameras are not brought into this meeting.
How about
and
that?
so I think you'll get to see it for
We'll get a little
yourself.
splash?
You'll get
Yeah.
to see it for yourself in a little bit, because the president relishes the optics of him being surrounded by some of the largest CEOs of companies that are global companies. And so it's hard for me to think that there won't be visual. You'll get to see the meeting yourself.
Yeah, well, see, but mark that down, Producer James. We might have a pool spray to be covering later on here on Balance of Power. Interesting watching the stocks. ExxonMobil's up a little bit. Chevron's up about 1.5%. Refiners like Valero are lower. How should investors be thinking about this with the president once again kind of emerging as the chairman of the board?
Well, again, I think there's a couple of things. For Chevron, for Exxon, there are dollars significant, particularly for Chevron and ConocoPhillips, billions of dollars the World Bank has said that you are owed because Venezuela seized these assets from you.
Right.
For Exxon, it's a small amount, but it's still over $1 billion.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of dollars that I would imagine that there's a higher prospect that gets paid out. So probably for shareholders, there's a notion that, hey, this is going to make a significant impact on their balance sheets. I think that for the president, he has got a continued commitment to trying to lower gas prices, and that's to his credit. I mean, oil prices are down significantly. Energy prices are down significantly since he came in. I think that you still have other prices that are much higher because of his trade agenda. But he wants, I think, to offset the trade agenda by continuing to lower energy prices as much as he can. But obviously, as you know, by the time you get any of this oil out of the ground onto the marketplace, it's going to be many years.
Yes, right. So we're going to be talking with the Energy Secretary a little bit later on today at the conclusion of this meeting. Should we expect takeaways today, or is this the start of a longer conversation?
I would imagine there'll be some takeaways about what a path could look like. I don't think there'll be something finalized today, but I would imagine Chris can give you a sense of here was the conversation, here's the commitment that these CEOs have, and here's what the president offered them.
Got it. Going to keep your former legislative affairs hat on here, because yesterday was a doozy on Capitol Hill, and I'm really deeply curious to hear your thoughts. We went up to the Capitol for the vote on ACA subsidies and talked to two Republicans who crossed over. Republican Nick LaLota, the congressman from Long Island, from New York, and Republican Ryan McKenzie of Pennsylvania. In that order, listen to what they told us after voting yes.
A lot of our constituents rely on these subsidies, and doing nothing we knew was not an option. So we wanted to, and we explored several different options before Christmas. Unfortunately, a number of them were blocked by our Rules Committee, and this was the only option available to us, was to pass this 3-year extension, which we understand is dead in arrival in the Senate.
Since running for office in 2024 on the campaign trail, the biggest issue that we heard about was affordability and cost of living issues, and so that has not changed. After 4 years of Bidenflation, people were suffering. Our efforts in the House are keeping this conversation alive, and what is going on in the Senate is they are looking at plans very similar to what we had already proposed here in the House, and so hopefully we'll get to one of those resolutions.
Really interesting to hear from both of them following that vote. 17 Republicans crossed over on the ACA. We'll see where that goes. I realize that's its own story. But 5 Republican senators voted for a War Powers Act. The president shamed them on social media. What's going on here?
Well, let's try and break them apart, because I think they are two separate issues. I think that on Obamacare and government-run health care, Democrats 15 years ago promised that it would lower costs and promised you like your doctor, you keep them. There's a lot of broken promises. Healthcare costs are astronomical today. The challenge for Republicans is they have not put forward an alternative. And so now you're in a box where Democrats say, we want to continue these subsidies. Cost of living is higher. Affordability prices is higher. And so for a lot of Republicans in swing districts, looking at the midterms, they want to be on record voting for things that keep prices down. Even if it's counterintuitive, the Republicans would be voting to continue government-run health care and these subsidies. So that's the dilemma for many of these Republicans. And I think it's added because I think the president wants the subsidies extended. He's concerned about the affordability issue. And so that's why you saw in his remarks earlier this week, something that's gotten less coverage, but the president saying to House Republicans, you need to have greater flexibility on the government taxpayers funding abortion. It was a remarkable statement for a Republican
Mm-hmm.
president to say. And I think what he's basically saying is he knows that's a tripwire for a lot of Republicans, and he's asking them to go along, in essence, with this. So I don't think this bill is going to pass in the Senate, but I do think what you're going to see is that the Senate is going to use that to map another pathway forward. And I think ultimately you're going to see these subsidies extended.
Is that the Moreno bill?
I think that's terrible policy. Terrible policy, but I think politically, I think that's where we're going to end up.
Because these two guys want to get reelected probably more than they're worried about being yelled at by Donald Trump.
Again, I think there are better ways the Republicans should be talking about, here's what's happened since we passed Obamacare. Here's the cost of how much health care has increased, and here's what we're going to have as an alternative. But they're not, in an absence of that, they're going to be forced to vote on whether you just continue the subsidies. That's I think a lot will.
Interesting.
On the War Powers Act, I think it's a totally separate argument. What I don't understand is why, I think, frankly, with all the news that's out there, it would have gotten less attention except for the president attacking those 5. Yeah. Like, why he chose to do that. Like, it is more of a posture vote that's really not impinging what he's doing in the moment. And so I think a wiser course would be to ignore it from his position. But to go after those 5 only elevates it into the national conversation.
Yeah. We're just showing the 5 on the screen if you're with us on Bloomberg TV. That said, would it have been your job in the first administration to get on the phone and rap knuckles on a day like that? How does beyond going on Truth Social, how does the White House handle a jailbreak?
Well, it is Legislative Affairs Director's job to make sure they're aware of where votes are and who's going where. Yeah. There's probably less influence you have as a staffer. I see. But by alerting the president can make calls to these people and say, hey, look, I don't want to see your vote going against me on this. Yeah. So there's ways to get ahead of it that I don't know if it happened or not. But I think that, look, this president is usually more engaged than most presidents. I remember when I came into the role, I actually met with my predecessor who had served in the Obama administration, and she gave me wonderful advice about doing the job, but it was remarkably different because I think Obama was gifted in so many ways, but he got kind of detached from Congress. This president has always been very engaged with members, and so it's not as if there's a lack of communication, and it's probably something that you should have the communication before as opposed to tweeting about after.
Great. Where's your gut on government funding? It looks like we might have a couple of minibuses, maybe a short-term CR. You're not worried about a shutdown, are you?
I think it's very unlikely we'll have another shutdown. I think there's been progress on the appropriations front, and I think that candidly for Democrats, they got everything they wanted out of the last shutdown, which I think has been counter the way these things have usually worked.
That's quite a statement, considering there's no subsidies to show for it.
Well, but politically,
they got it back on the menu, right?
Politically, they gained a lot, and I still think they're going to get their subsidies at the end of the day. Yeah, okay. And I think traditionally, when Republicans have shut down the government and saying we're going to leverage that for some other policy, we've always lost. And it seems I think the Democrats got the leverage and the political win too.
As Donald Trump's former legislative affairs director, what do you think when you hear people say that he's the actual Speaker of the House?
Well,
I'm sure you see it more nuanced than that, but is there some truth to it?
There is. I think what the president has been very effective at is, whether you like it or you don't, he's been far more willing to engage in primaries in a way that strikes fear amongst House Republicans. And so they're more willing to walk in lockstep. Traditionally, a Republican or Democrat president's looked at like, I'm not going to criticize my own team because the downside is you could get replaced by a Democrat. But this president's looked at it to say, I'm going to keep my team in step by them understanding I'd be willing to primary them. And so he's had far more influence as a president over this Congress than traditionally a president does over his own team.
Maybe you set the new model. Marc, it's great to see you. We appreciate the insights as always.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Of course, is Marc Short with us live here in Washington, former White House Director, Legislative Affairs, former Chief of Staff to Vice President Mike Pence. We'll assemble our panel next with the idea of Trump not only as Speaker, but as Chairman of the Board. It's straight ahead on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg. As we wait for the big oil executives to arrive at the White House, just about an hour from now, the big black SUVs ought to be rolling down the driveway. About a dozen or more executives sitting down with President Trump in the cabinet room. The Energy Secretary, who's going to join us on the late edition of Balance of Power, will be there, along with the Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, who spoke earlier today on Bloomberg, being asked the same question that so many are asking: where is all the money going to come from? We're talking about a potential $100 billion investment over a decade in a dilapidated oil industry in Venezuela. Will there be subsidies? Where's the cash from? Burgum says underground. Listen.
The capital is going to come from the capital markets and come from the energy companies. I don't see that these companies are going to need support from the U.S. other than things around security. I mean, if we can provide a secure, stable environment, the resource here is so significant and so large that it's going to be attractive for people to go in and develop that.
We asked Congressman Byron Donalds, the Republican from Florida, a Trump ally, about this very issue. He said, I'm not interested in subsidies. And in many cases, these executives might not be interested in ponying up all of their own money. So there is reporting by CNN that they're going to ask for something in return here, a lifting of sanctions, more supplies necessary to move the oil as they try to ramp up by hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. This, of course, is not the first time that President Trump has waded into the private sector. Far from. The CEO of Intel was at the White House just 2 days ago. It was yesterday, actually, talking about progress being made on semiconductors, remembering that, well, the government took a stake in the company. Then there was just a couple of days back the president's call for institutional investors to be banned from buying single-family homes. And so it brings us back to this question of whether Donald Trump sees himself or is, in fact, the chairman of the board for every Fortune 500 company. Our panel has thoughts on this. Bloomberg Politics contributor and Republican strategist Rick Davis is here, partner at Stonecourt Capital, alongside Democratic strategist Arshi Siddiqui, founder, CEO, Bellwether Government Affairs. It's great to have both of you with us. Arshi, how do you see this idea? You work with a lot of corporate clients, and you have a very good sense of the chain of command inside a company. But when Donald Trump calls, everything changes.
Yeah, it's been an interesting dynamic because but not surprising, because you look at the trend. He has done an exceptional job of taking full control of every lever of power in Washington.
Yeah.
I mean, that has been significant, and he's expanded that. So you look at his moves in universities. We looked at across the board. You look at universities. You look at the Kennedy Center in terms of culture. We've seen that lately. Yeah. The media. I mean, comedy, late night comedy. I mean, right. Across the board. So when you look at his efforts here, it's been interesting because if a Democratic president was doing this, there would, I think, be a lot of pushback. I mean, this does smack of state-sponsored capitalism.
Well, so there you go. And then that becomes a question, Rick Davis, about whether any of this is conservative. And I want both of your take on this meeting today. But as we start broadly here, Rick, how do you see it?
Well, it's certainly not a firm commitment to capital markets and free and fair trade, right? So, yeah, it is definitely state-sponsored capitalism. It's a complete change from what you would have seen in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s by a Republican president. If anything, it sort of mirrors his domestic populism, which is significantly different than what you might have found from previous Republican presidents. Conservatism defined a completely different way. And so, yeah, not only is he dominating the spheres of business and politics and culture, like Siddiqui said, but I think he's really sort of dominating the idea of crafting a new political dynamic. We keep talking about sort of the context of politics in America as being, Republicans versus Democrats with a little sliver of independence in between. And I think he's blurred all those lines. I mean, it's very hard without a scorekeeper to say which side of the aisle he's on. And so I think it's kept Democrats on their toes, but it's really flexed them to Republicans too. And so, yeah, this is not market economy. This is state-run economy. And corporations, at least the oil companies, seem to get it. That's why they're going to be there today talking to the president about what their business decisions are going to be as it relates to the largest oil reserves in the world. Normally, we wouldn't need a government to spur development of that. It would be in their own self-interest and their shareholders' interests. So we'll see what the president comes up with today.
Really interesting to hear you put it like that, Rick. Arshi, what comes out of this meeting today with everything that we just heard? Do they have to say yes?
I think we've seen a running trend where the corporate community wants to find a win-win and threading the needle. And so as you kind of laid this out, I think they will try to find a path forward. But there's some real challenges in Venezuela, as you well know. I mean, Also, the big issue also is that there's billions of dollars that were stuck under the Chavez regime that are still owed.
Yes.
So that you can add that to the list of issues. But this is the timelines don't match up, interestingly, in the sense that Donald Trump has 3 years left.
Well, there you
go. And then you have a much longer run time on some of these investments and what this looks like in terms of overall outlook.
What kind of a promise can they be given then, or assurances, Rick, for what we're told would be a 10-year project, not to get things, off the ground, but to really get it where it needs to be? A complete investment in a rebuilding of the infrastructure would take a decade and $100 billion. What if the next president doesn't like this idea? Then these companies, again, are left holding the bag, right?
Yeah, I think the number one issue is security. Nobody's going to send delegations there with roving bands of militia thinking they control various neighborhoods. Whoops, we took a wrong turn. Now we're going to get kidnapped. Well, sorry, Mr. CEO. We'll call Trump and he'll get you out. So the number one thing is going to be security. And how does the president achieve security if he's kept the Maduro regime in place? And that the army is basically the same army that was running the place all along. So that's number one. Number two is, what's the long-term capacity to perform? Because, I know that everyone's looking at this money that Venezuela owns these companies that were there before they nationalized their interest, but they don't have any money. They can't pay this bill. So they got to look at what's into the ground, because that's the only asset they have. And how do you get it out of the ground? Well, the industry has decayed there a lot. You got to be able to fix it. Well, who's going to pay for that? Well, I mean, I'm not sure these oil companies think that's the easiest way to find hydrocarbons. And how many institutional investors want to put money into hydrocarbons these days? That's not been the most in vogue thing to invest in over the last 2 decades. How many corporations really want to be the oil guy? At the end of the day, it's really hard to see how this pieces together in the short run. Certainly in the long run, having access and control of those assets ensures that the United States can play power oil politics around the world. And that's meaningful with Russia and China, especially.
Arshi, you could suggest that the tariff regime is in itself another move against corporate America, in that they have had to swallow some of these prices. But more than 1,000 companies have sued the Trump administration in advance of a ruling by the Supreme Court. And as you know, on Bloomberg, we thought we might get that ruling at 10 o'clock this morning. It is decision day, but it didn't come out yet. So we're on to next week now, potentially, on a court that may well strike down the tariff regime. Is this, again, where we find the line? Costco's not alone. You've got 1,000 companies that those lawsuits would be triggered immediately if the Supreme Court strikes this down.
Yeah, but as you know, it took a while for them to get there.
Sure.
And also, a lot of companies were taking the hit internally. They weren't raising prices. So
That's
even
right.
Even though we've seen prices increase for American consumers, there's still been the safety net, and that's not sustainable. And I think that's why you saw these companies coming together, because it isn't sustainable going into the future. But you go down any grocery aisle today, and it's a troubling situation.
Yeah. Do they win these cases, Rick? If the Supreme Court decides the fate of the tariff regime and it must come to an end, I realize they've got about 5 or 6 other potential forms of justification. But with more than 1,000 lawsuits at the ready, if the Supreme Court says no more tariffs, what happens?
Yeah, look, I think this is a massive accounting issue, right? There's got to be verification of who paid what tariffs, how much was it for, how much of that was given to the government in the pricing that they had in their products. And that will include, by the way, in some cases, foreign governments that paid the tariff, right, in order to keep their distribution. How are we going to start writing checks to these various countries? I mean, that'll really be a political problem for this administration. But it becomes an accounting nightmare, and a lot of people are going to have to be brought in to help sort it out. That being said, it's only an accounting nightmare. I think the real problem is a rebuke by the Supreme Court, if it happens, of the president's powers over tariffs. And I think it's unlikely that this is going to be black or white. I think the Supreme Court has proven that they really don't want to go straight at Donald Trump. And so it's likely that there's some partial resolution to this tariff issue by the Supreme Court. And that just makes it even more complicated.
Just what Wall Street wants to hear. You know, if the Supreme Court, by the way, everyone thinks they know what's going to happen here, Arshi. If the Supreme Court rules that the tariffs stay in place, we could have another Liberation Day kind of market, which we would rather not relive.
Absolutely. But I think also the Supreme Court won't be the end of the story. I think immediately the administration will look for other ways.
There's never an end of the story.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That's the whole essence of the chaos that you've been talking about.
Absolutely.
The court rules, partial ruling, appeal. Everyone's still worried about it. Rick, we've only got about 30 seconds left. If this actually does hit next week, how nervous should investors be?
Well, it's going to be sectoral, right? I mean, a lot of companies aren't really that affected by tariffs, so they'll remain unaffected. But those that are can expect a wild ride on the markets.
And we may not, as Rick said, get a complete decision, and we may not get one that includes refunds as they push things potentially back down to a lower court. We've got a lot to learn still together. Rick Davis, Arshi Siddiqui, thank you so much for your insights in our smart panel today on Balance of Power. Heather Boushey, former White House economist, is coming in next on this Jobs Day, only on Bloomberg. Donald Trump had the CEO, Lip Boutin, at the White House yesterday, went on social media, said some nice things about him. New high. Just one of the stories we're following today as big oil executives converge on the White House, and we have news. That meeting is less than an hour away. It was going to be in the cabinet room, as we've been discussing, and it was going to be closed press as well. That all just changed. While Charlie was talking, the White House moved this event to the East Room, opened it to press, and in fact, an expanded press pool. So as Marc Short said, just like that, the cameras and microphones will be allowed in the room, as the likes of ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, and the rest, Valero, all in the house. Harold Hamm was spotted at the White House. They're all there to talk about investing in Venezuela. The president's asked for a multi-billion-dollar investment over the course of a decade. On what is a jobs day, any other time, this would have probably been our lead story because it was the first complete jobs report we've had in a while following the whole government shutdown, the longest in American history. Really interesting to hear from Rick Reeder this morning on Bloomberg TV and radio. Interestingly, who's said to be on the short list to be the next Fed chair, yet there's reporting Scott Bessent said he hasn't actually had his interview with President Trump yet, who claims he already made up his mind. The read on the jobs report from Reeder, of course, Chief Investment Officer Fixed Income at BlackRock, seeing a below forecast payrolls number and also a lower than expected unemployment rate. Here's what he said.
We're talking about 50,000 jobs and then a revision down over 70,000 jobs. If you take, we're growing now, if you go to last 6 month moving average, if you take out healthcare jobs, we're actually running negative jobs for the last 6 months away from healthcare, which is non-cyclical, not interest rate sensitive. Actually, if you go back 8 months, the total net jobs is negative 213,000 jobs net of healthcare. What I think is going on is we have a productivity revolution of extraordinary proportion.
Fascinating, but also very difficult to quantify. And it's where we start our conversation with Heather Boushey. Used to serve, of course, on the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden White House when we spoke frequently, chief economist for the Invest in America cabinet. Heather, it's great to see you. Welcome back. How would you describe this jobs report and the impact of productivity?
Well, this is I would describe it as a lackluster report, right? We haven't, the 50,000 jobs gained last month. We've seen over the past year, over 2025, 49,000 jobs gained on average each month. That's less than a third of the pace that we saw in 2024. We've seen the pace of wage gains, although a little bit faster than it was in recent months, is actually slower than it was in 2023 or 2024. And that is with ongoing higher prices that American consumers are facing. So I think from the worker perspective, this isn't a great report. It's not a terrible report. It doesn't, is in line with expectations. It doesn't signal that we're in a recession or something like that. But it certainly doesn't bode well for millions of workers who are looking for work and for the labor market more generally. And to that point about healthcare, I think, this is a big story, I think, in the labor market right now that, net jobs for 2025 really were all about healthcare. And yet the Trump administration has made these huge cuts to the healthcare sector through the tax legislation passed in the spring, the cuts to Medicaid, the cuts now through the cuts to the Affordable Care Act subsidies. And so I think that opens up real big questions about what healthcare looks like as we go into the new year.
How are you looking at this through the prism of the Fed? The worries about a soft job market led the market to believe another cut was coming. But when you see the unemployment rate dropping like this, what does it tell you?
Well, I think this is a tough report for the Federal Reserve, and I think all indications are that they are probably gonna pause, but obviously we'll have to wait and see. From their perspective, prices remain higher than their preferred 2% rate, and we saw unemployment come down a little bit. I think we're also seeing that the layoffs that were happening across the federal government appear to have abated. So there does seem to be some stability in the labor market. Again, it's not like we saw massive job losses this month. We're just seeing this tepid, pace of growth at about 50,000 a month. So I think that will probably lead them to wait for the next round of data. And of course, they're also still struggling with the fact that we didn't have data for a few months because of the government shutdown. So I think they probably want to be extra careful that we are getting good data and might want to wait to see what the benchmark revisions look like that are coming at the beginning of the year to the labor market data.
As we spend time with Heather Boushey, I want to mention some breaking news as the president is posting on social media ahead of his meeting with Big Oil. He's got Colombia on his mind. He says he's looking forward to having a meeting with Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, in the White House first week of February. So we've got something on the calendar here, it seems. He says, I'm sure it'll work out very well for Colombia and the USA, but cocaine and other drugs must be stopped from coming into the U.S. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Heather, I'm curious your thoughts on this meeting today at the White House with Big Oil in the room and a big ask from the president here. We've heard from the administration that this effort to start investing in a broken oil infrastructure in Venezuela is America first and will help our economy by lowering oil prices. Is that your expectation?
Well, here's the thing. From the perspective of American consumers, gas prices have come down quite a bit. And any benefit that they're going to see at the pump is going to take a long time to come to fruition. And we've also heard the president say that he wants a massive increase in what the American people pay for defense, for all of the work that's going to be required to maintain that presence in Venezuela and the other actions that he's taking around the world. The president has also said that he wants the American people to subsidize some of these investments that he wants the oil companies to make. I think those are big question marks. Where does this end? Where does this go? So I have a lot of questions about whether or not this will actually benefit the American people. And of course, this is alongside all the steps that this administration has taken to make electricity prices more expensive in the here and now. All of the cutbacks that he did to the investments that were happening across the country in electricity in the grid and in lowering families' energy prices. He's got a very confusing message on energy right now. And, as your opening segment talked about, this is a decades-long investment. And I think we have to wonder whether or not future administrations will be committed to the same kind of, imperialist tendencies that this president is. So if I were the American taxpayer, which of course I am an American taxpayer, I have a lot of questions for how this meeting goes today and what the president expects the American people to pay in the here and now.
Yeah, shareholders do too. Heather, it's good to see you. Thank you for coming back on Bloomberg TV and radio. Heather Boushey with us on Balance of Power. President back on Truth Social. He's looking forward to the meeting here. He just posted once again, the largest oil companies in the world are coming to the White House at 2:30 p.m. He's right, a little more than a half hour away. Everybody wants to be there. It's too bad the ballroom hasn't completed, because if it were, it would be packed, he says. We apologize to those oil companies we cannot take today. But Secretary of Energy Chris Wright, Secretary of Interior Doug Burgum will see them over the next week. We did learn yesterday they didn't reach for the bigger ballroom. I guess it's going to be 22,000 square feet, but of course they haven't built that yet. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, and we thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power as we turn to our closer. I was so glad to hear that Nancy was coming in, because she's up with a really interesting profile that I want you to find on the terminal or online. Remember when they used to call Karl Rove Bush's brain? Is Stephen Miller Trump's brain? Now I'm going to get Nancy Cook in trouble. She's with us to talk about this great story that I mentioned. Stephen Miller and the policy shaping Trump's next 3 years. Bloomberg senior national political correspondent. It's great to see you. Stephen Miller, Trump's brain?
Well, interestingly, a bunch of Trump people call him the prime minister.
The prime minister?
Yes.
That's a different wrinkle, because he has found himself, as you describe here, with a much broader portfolio in this second term. How important is he compared to the actual chief of staff, for instance, in running policy in the agenda in this administration?
I think he's just as important as Susie Wiles.
Yeah.
And what I uncovered in the reporting is he's actually really functioning like a cabinet secretary in this particular term. I think people so often associate him just with immigration from the first term.
Yeah.
And there's good reason for that. He was key behind the expansion of ICE, mass deportations, a lot of the immigration policy. However, this term, he is playing a huge role in the strategy on Venezuela, for instance, and what is happening there, foreign policy, national security, going after elite universities and pulling their federal funding. I mean, just every single area of policy, even economic ones where we don't think of him as playing, like trade and tariffs, he is playing a key role. He is really the main person for whom policy is running in this term. And so the piece just looks at how he operates in the West Wing.
Is he feared?
He's completely
internally.
He's very much feared internally. He has a very large staff. And one of the other interesting things I learned in the course of reporting is he has allies kind of in all these different crevices of the government, which really just helps him exercise power in all these different places.
Sure.
He has allies at the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Council, White House counsel's office, sort of all these pockets that really help him pull the levers of power. He's quite good at that.
There's some reporting recently on the way he conducts conference calls. You don't want to cross the boss if his name is Stephen Miller.
You don't. And a key part of his role is not just coming up with the policy, but is also executing it. One person that I talked to for this story told me about on things like energy policy, for instance. He'll convene a call in his office, with all the people who are involved in energy policies from all the different agencies and basically bark orders at them, to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to.
Yeah. You mentioned Venezuela. His remarks about America's right to take that land were striking just in the last couple of days here. His view of the world order, it seems, does help to inform the president's view.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that part of the reason that he is so powerful is because he's very loyal to Trump, but also part of it is because he is the person in the White House who is most aligned with Trump's gut on issues. And he and Secretary of State Marco Rubio are really the two key people inside the administration moving ahead with the Venezuela planning. I would say Rubio's sort of maybe the more diplomatic of the two, the one they send out on Sunday shows.
Yes.
But Stephen is the president's id on this.
Yeah, okay.
And is really driving the policy.
Wow. You referenced his interview on CNN in the piece where he referred to our right. You can talk all you want about international niceties and everything else, but we live in a world, in the real world, he says, that is governed by strength, by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world. You covered the first Trump administration. Is that the same Stephen Miller?
Yes, he is the same. I have covered him for almost a decade. He is the same. He has not changed. He does these like ranty, media appearances. He has very strongly held beliefs.
Yeah.
I think the difference is he just has so much power now.
Interesting.
And, really there's only two aides I can think of who have lasted this long continuously in the Trump organization. One is Dan Scavino, who is Trump's former longtime, golf caddy, who then did social media in the first administration and who's now the director of personnel, and Stephen Miller.
Wow. Isn't that amazing? Does he like getting calls from Nancy Cook? Does he deal with reporters?
No comment.
Okay. Find the story on the terminal or online. Really interesting and great reporting as always, because it came from the great Nancy Cook. It's good to see you, Nancy, of course, and great to see you. 2:30, we're a half hour away from the big oil meeting. They just expanded it, and they are going to bring the press in. So stay with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We will give you a fly-on-the-wall view, and I'll meet you back here on the 5 p.m. edition of Balance of Power. We'll have Energy Secretary Chris Wright with us, only here on Bloomberg.